Hey everybody, welcome to the Eternal card breakdown, Eternal spoiler breakdown as things go. So we're looking at Into Darkness. It is releasing this week, as was announced on the latest event test. Very, very exciting stuff. I'm really excited about it, and yeah, we're going to be having some fun figuring out what all is going to be going on with this new set. There's a bunch of new cards that have been released, a bunch of them on the Into Darkness setup, or the Into Shadow setup, and the event. Wow. Let's start that over real quick. Hey everybody, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown. My name is Pojo, and today we're going to be looking at all of the new cards that were released with Into Darkness. Starting with Dead or Alive, which was announced last week. They had an Into Shadow tournament event pretty recently that worked out really well. Like, it seemed like it was a lot of fun, and they showed off a bunch of new cards from that, and there were also two other cards that were released before that, which we're going to cover first. So yeah, let's go ahead and go into it. First off, we have Dead or Alive, which is a 5-cost double green fast spell that says play a wanted poster on each enemy unit that dealt damage to you this turn. Wanted poster being a 2-cost curse that attaches to enemy units, and when those units die, you draw 2 cards. So essentially, this is a card that you play in a very specific, narrow situation, which is you're being attacked by a bunch of units, you're not going to die if those units hit you, and you want a lot of cards. All of those things have to be true before this card is good, and the fourth thing that probably has to be true is that you have to have a harsh rule in hand, or some other form of like ridiculous nonsense control setup. So basically, your opponent attacks you with a bunch of stuff, you play the wanted posters on all of their units, which is like, you know, maybe 2 to 3, and then you harsh rule and you draw like 6 cards, which is a lot of card draw. So yeah, that's a lot to put together. I would say overall this card is not actually all that good. It's got some potential in like some control matchups and certain particular setups, but one of the things about a lot of units attacking you is that like often those decks have rally and are just going to kill you immediately. So they don't care how many cards you're drawing off of Dead or Alive, and they mostly care if you have Harsh Rule or not, which Dead or Alive is standing slightly in the way of that. But this is a fun card for just generating lots and lots of card advantage in very silly control decks. Let's say it's specifically designed for exactly that. You can play it on like some small setups where basically you get it on like 2 units and then you kill those units, and like sort of like in slower grindy control matchups I can actually see this card being somewhat beneficial, where you're just taking a little bit of damage just to make some wanted posters at a really expensive cost, and then, you know, use single target removal or something along those lines to get those wanted posters to explode and make, you know, cards for you. So that could be pretty fun overall. Like, that's really not a bad idea and could be beneficial if you're playing it on that setup. I would not say that if you're playing Dead or Alive you should expect it to go off on a regular basis. This is more for a deck that wants to run like a lot of life gain and do like really dumb control things and just sort of force your opponent to play into Dead or Alive. Most of the time people are going to either read this trick and really mess you up, or they're going to like just kill you without even knowing the trick is there. So that's basically what's going on with this one. Like, it's okay, but it doesn't really have like an amazing amount of strength to it. There are some potential situations where Dead or Alive does really good things, and keeping an eye on those situations is certainly worth paying attention to. Particularly good against any time where the meta is full of decks that do like a lot of light pinging, things like Calderan Channeler or Scouting Party or like Shimmer Pack style decks. If you're playing with like a lot of like little tokens, like Praxis tokens, then Dead or Alive becomes better. But the main thing about it is that you still have to actually stay alive, which is tricky to do. But if it draws you like 6 cards and you only take like 6 damage, that's probably worth it for a harsh rule. So in those narrow scenarios, this card is pretty okay. And yeah, it's a fun janky control card. I think it's a little bit weird and like, you know, it promotes like this sort of slow control style that I don't really like in Eternal. It's more of like a Temporal Distortion, Chalice style card that's going to do kind of ridiculous shenanigans. But it's also so high risk, high reward that like it's fine. It's certainly not a bad card. It does interesting things, and it's pretty interesting to see. Okay, next thing we have is Sealed Writ, another card off of our Soul setup, which we haven't really been seeing so far. So yeah, Soul was something that was established as like a Combrei faction type thing. Genetrix Irel is from a particular faction that worships the god Soul, and Sealed Writ is Transmute 7 that turns into Word of Soul. What does Word of Soul do, shall we say? Well, glad you asked. Word of Soul deals 4 damage and has double damage while you have no other cards in hand. It's a 7-cost spell. It's not fast. But yeah, so you have basically a colorless power in your deck that is not depleted, which is really important. Like, that is not a depleted power. So this card is actually pretty decent in some mono faction decks, because most of the time you're not going to care too much about like how much influence you have of a particular faction. There are some pretty good payoffs for running like a single faction setup of colors. Like, most of them are pretty good, but in particular Primal does not have a good payoff for just having a bunch of Primal influence. So a card like Word of Soul feels pretty good there, even though you do have like Channel the Tempest at the top. So yeah, if you're doing like a primal aggro deck, I think that's probably where this fits. It's a 7-cost card that at 7, like when you are finally, and once you're at 7, like this is way better than Transmute 5, because you are not actually like wrecking your chances of getting to really, really expensive cards. This card will only transform when you actually need it, and it's an amazing top deck because it deals, you know, like 4 to 8 damage, which is pretty crazy, and it can target units as well. I think this card is relatively strong in the particular setups that you want it in, which is to say very low influence cost, very capable of emptying their hand, and generally interested in a lot of value packed into a very, very small setup. Now, you know, like, this does mean that you don't get to play quite as many influence in your deck. You have to be careful, like, what kind of decks are actually demanding a lot of influence, but if you find that your deck does not require a lot of influence, Word of Soul seems like it's going to be pretty reasonable. I particularly like it in Primal. I think that there's a really good Primal aggro spell damage deck that works out with this card, because if you give spell damage +1 to Word of Soul, then it's going to do 10 damage instead of 4. If you use like Maelstrom Bell to increase its damage, that's a pretty good deal. Iceberg Warchief, the 3-cost 3/3 flyer, those cards are perfectly playable. There are cards like Boltcrafter Shaman that probably aren't as playable, but like if you're just doing like a mono blue deck with like a bunch of Berserk units and aggressive units and like sort of that damage focus that Primal has been kind of lacking lately, I think that there is a deck there that really kind of works with Word of Soul, and that's probably where I'd look to start as far as setting this card up. It's less good in Mono Fire, weirdly enough, just because Mono Fire really likes to capitalize off of Flash Fire, and Word of Soul doesn't really help out with that, so you actually lose some damage that way in some scenarios. But it's not bad in Mono Fire, and if you want to play like a sort of aggressive, interesting deck on that front, yeah, I can definitely see it being pretty useful in that setup. Could be very good with Veteran Mercenary, the card that like draws a bunch of cards and gives you lots of value. Like, this is just a really interesting top deck. I like this card a lot, and while there are a lot of good decks right now that need a lot of heavy influence and a lot of like crests and other things like this is a really interesting way to restructure a low influence deck and add power to decks that currently aren't represented in the meta and can be very, very good. So I'm very into this card. It's really interesting power, and I'm very excited to see where it goes. For a colorless card, it's surprisingly dangerous. You know, you don't want to see Word of Soul in every single like deck, so you got to be very, very careful about that, but I don't think that it is a high enough payoff for the risk of losing the influence. You just need to be playing it in decks that are more monocolor or less influence in general. Still, that card seems really, really sweet, and overall I'm pretty excited about it. Okay, what else have we got? Well, we got this goat. This goat's about to get eaten by a dragon, and this goat is actually created by another card. It is not a real card, it is just a token, but I just wanted to show off the goat. I like this goat quite a bit, except he kind of looks like he has wings because of the dragon swooping down on him, but just minor art things. This card comes from Poaching Drake. Poaching Drake is a 4/3 flying that summon you may transform you may transform an enemy unit with cost 3 or less into a 2/1 goat. So if you want to mess up your opponent's Teacher of Humility, that's a pretty good option. It is double blue influence. It's a 4/3 flyer. Overall, that stat line's not too bad. Like, 4 cost is not great for, like, you know, Shadow has like 5/5 flyers at this cost. 3 health is not a lot. It's pretty torchable, and it is like, you know, it's one of the worst stat lines as far as things go. The flying aspect of it is very, very nice, and it does do a decent amount of damage. It does some pretty cool things, and it also messes up your opponent's stuff as well. So there's a lot of things to like about Poaching Drake. I think that like in a mono primal sort of aggressive deck, I can see this card doing a decent amount of work. It plays pretty well into a lot of like snowball based effects. It is really fascinating. I think it's just got interesting potential. I don't know if it's a super powered card, but I really want to see like some primal spell damage snowball decks and like stuff going on, and I think that there's a lot of support for that faction and a lot of support for these types of archetypes in what's coming up in card set. Like basically, we've already seen Word of Soul, which plays well with like sort of these more primal focused decks. I'm always interested in seeing more power put into primal or into more focused primal decks. This is a potentially good focused primal card that could main deck primal into like an aggro or mid-range BD type of setup, because it's a little bit of value with a pretty good flying sort of that line. So yeah, pretty excited about it. Would be nice if it was like a 4/4 or something so it didn't die to Torch or Hailstorm, but it's got some potential and the ability to transform enemy units, a lot of which are very scary, into smaller things is really cool, even if that cost 3 or less setup is on there. I think this card actually does do pretty well against like Rakano setups and Skycrag setups where you're just like making their stuff into much worse stuff, and yeah, that could potentially be really good. Also, it eats merchants, Aurelian Merchant in particular. You need good counters to merchants in the current meta. Like, Aurelian Merchant is just too good. So anything that actually, like, just destroys that ramp effect, like, on curve at the right time, that's pretty useful and should be noted just as a slight bonus to the card. That is something that actually does interact with merchants on a reasonable level. Okay, what else? What else have we got? We're not going to go into Telut until last, but Waystone Titan is real exciting, so let's go ahead and open that sucker up. 5/7/4/6, triple fire influence. Oh boy, this card is like everything I want out of a fire card, I think. So it's really interesting to see fire cards with more health than attack. This is actually something that Eternal can do really well. Eternal's got very good potential for aggro cards that can actually be somewhat beefy on the ground. Like, that is not like a particular restriction of fire. Fire is the faction of creation and destruction. It can be really aggressive, and it can still have some level of like, this is just a large stat thing, because it's you know, it's borrowing a little bit from Time, where you've got Sentinels in general. But I think that design actually does work, and on this charge unit in particular, it seems really powerful. A lot of good things about this card. So first off, it's a 5/7 that renews its own cost if it hits, which allows you to cast something new, i.e. Heart of the Vault. Seems like the pretty obvious option. The one that is really clearly interesting is because you are attacking with a charge unit for a lot of damage. If you're just playing this in like a mid-rangey aggro deck where you've got like a ton of charge units or flying units or, you know, that kind of stuff, and you're just trying to push through, you can Waystone Titan, charge in, do your 6, get the 6 back, cast Bad News, Waystone Titan again, and if you have more Bad News, you can keep doing that until you kill your opponent. Like, actually, I think this card can kill your opponent with just 4 Bad News, and, you know, it's a way to turn 5 cards into 25 damage, so that's always interesting and a lot of fun. And you don't see a lot of Bad News decks in general, so this could be really cool in like a warp deck with maybe some Skycrag charge where you're doing Workshop Forge, Resurface, and like basically just constantly repeating Bad News over and over again while ramping out other stuff. Like, that's really cool. After Waystone Titan has stuck on the ground once, it wants to hit the enemy player again, and it always wants to hit the enemy player, which is the tricky part. But if you can actually get it to hit the enemy player again, then it ramps you for 6, which allows you to cast, you know, things like Decimate or anything that costs 10 to 12. You can do really ridiculous things with that. Play your biggest Sentinels, play your stupidly high ramp effects. If you can find a way to like cheat this out or ambush it or do something silly with that, then yeah, this card does insanity. Like, I'm really excited about this card. It does seem like it's got a lot of cool brews that you can do with it, and it also just seems like it's powerful. Like, as far as I can tell, like, that stat line is very good. It's monocolored, which means it dies to Annihilate at 6, which is not so great, and it's also very deep in fire, which means that it's not going to splash into some of the best decks at the moment. But good mono fire decks can definitely play this card. There's gotta be ways that this can just turn into a ridiculous amount of damage very early, and the fact that it might legitimize Bad News is certainly something that I'm interested in. So Yeah, like overall, this one looks like one of the more interesting cards to watch out for in the upcoming campaign. I think it's going to be pretty powerful, and I'm very excited to see what all is done with it. Also, it's a Titan made out of Waystones, which, yeah, that's an interesting story beat. Well, let's see here. What else is going on? We've got like some interesting throwbacks to a lot of different cards. We have Sentinels right now, and we have Drakes. We have our wanted poster set up. A lot of little interesting throwbacks. The one that I want to show off right now is Maul. This one was spoiled on the stream, so the image is a little bit poor quality, but that is, in fact, 12, 16-foot tall bear, probably. It's a big bear. Okay, so this card is actually Greed's Reward. There's a red card that I really loved. I wanted this card back so badly, guys. I'm so glad to see it again, and I'm glad to see it in blue, honestly. This is a great place for it. It is a 6-cost spell that deals 2 damage to the enemy player for each card in their hand. It was originally called Greed's Reward, and now it is called Maul, and is just a big old bear that you can sick on control decks to make them very sad. This card is a lot of fun. I really enjoy this card. It's a fascinating sideboard for any sort of like merchant pile. Like if you're just playing... If you're playing the 3-2 Merchant, this is a really solid sideboard choice, because it is something that if you are up against a Temporal Mirror, or if you're up against, well, not a Temporal Mirror, just a Temporal deck in general, if you're up against Chalice, if you're up against Nightfall, there are a lot of decks that actually just accumulate tons and tons of cards. Maul destroys those decks, and that's really, really good stuff. Yeah, so nothing changed about this card beyond it just turning a different color. I think it is actually a really cool primal color card. I think it's a good place to add some interesting value for that, and I'm actually a little curious as to how this interacts with spell damage. That didn't exist with Greed's Reward, so it's possible that this card with spell damage allows you to deal 3 damage for each card in their hand, and like continue to sort of increase that value to the point where you basically, like, if you have a way to increase spell damage, there's some cool payoffs there. Spell damage seems to be like one of the central themes of what's going on in this campaign. Like if you want to do spell damage decks, there are now some really interesting support cards. I can see cards like Maelstrom Bell actually being playable, just because of cards like Maul and Word of Soul. So yeah, could be pretty interesting. All right, Patrick Chapin, he's saying that it just deals 1 extra damage as opposed to multiple extra damage, but that would have been nice. Anyways. Or at least that's what my chat is telling me, Patrick. Okay, other stuff. Let's see here. Well, we got Signal Flare, another one from the stream. Deal 2 damage and scout for 1. This seems nice. Like it is a little mini torch at slow spell speed. It's got a scout attached to it, which is not bad. Like overall, this seems like a fine aggro card. I don't think there is anything crazy going on with it. It is not fast. It doesn't do a lot of amazing things, but it seems interesting. I like that the person is just like throwing that Signal Flare at... I'm pretty sure that's a Radiant. It could be a Dragon. It's kind of hard to say. But, like, yeah, that is just, like, interesting, like, fun little card. I like the art on it. I like the overall flavor of it. I'm not sure how many decks really want to play this, but it's fine. Yeah, it's a good little average card that just does a lot of little bits of work for fire, and I can definitely see this card being played. Whether or not it is good is going to be really dependent on... I'm not 100% certain how to judge this, really. Like, it's interesting in sort of mono-fire setups. You do want some amount of scry. Like, I think it's good in spell damage again, and that's always interesting. So, yeah, there's some potential here to see, like, some really good results out of Signal Flare. And I'm looking forward to seeing what those cards do. It's also not a bad card to pull off of Acquisitive Crow. So, you know, as far as, like, one-drop spells go, this is some pretty nice thing that you can play around with. But, yeah, doesn't seem bad. Okay. Next up. Oh yeah, we gotta talk about our shadow cards. There are 2 of them, and they're both pretty interesting, and both feature some of the central villains of Eternal. So first off, we have our Mokto card. I don't like the art on this one, but whatever. It's called Last Chance. Draw a unit from your void, and it gets void bound. Yeah, I mean, it's a good Dark Return effect for 0 that does a lot of good work. You get to repeat a lot of very nasty cards with very good results, and you get to play this like after a Dark Return or before a Dark Return and get really good value out of it. I would say that the fact that it is not abusable with Voidbound is interesting. There are a lot of high recursion decks that I love playing, and Last Chance does give you a pretty sincere drawback to what's going on with its ability, but it also allows you to replay units in a very good way. So this is a card to watch out for, because you get to just play some of your nastiest stuff over and over again. Tavrods, Shadowlands Tyrants, Worldbearer Behemoth, Amili, Cloud Marshal, anything that actually has like the ability to recur and get benefits that way, that's always a big deal. Jotun Hurler, or Jotun Feastcaller rather. If you want to grab cool fate effects, if you want to do like basically more cockroaches, if you want to do anything with recursive value where you are just increasing the value of the card over time, this does prevent you from recurring the card again, but you can still get like some very good benefits from it, and that seems like it's going to be pretty interesting to see. You could silence the card to get the Voidbound away, so if you have a big pile of stats, there are some ways to play around with that. Eye on the Abductor silences a Voidbound unit and gets it back, but, you know, that's not really super important, I think, for the card. Mostly it's just a really good way to repeat killer effects without you having to spend the extra point of power that you would on Dark Return. I'd say it's a little bit less powerful than Dark Return, but there is room right now in Eternal for 2 Dark Returns, so this potentially has some play. Alright, and now we get to the true villain of the story, Scruffles McFluffington, Cabal Chaircat, taking people's jewels. Alright, so we're up for the Shakedown. This is a 1-cost Nightfall card. Choose a card with cost 3 or less from the enemy player's hand, and they discard it. So it's an interesting Nightfall trigger. I actually don't think this card is super powerful. It is a sabotage style effect that doesn't always hit, and also against aggro decks it triggers Nightfall, which aggro decks are the cards that you're most likely to hit. So against aggro decks it triggers Nightfall, which means that you discard one of their like pretty aggressive cards like a Whirling Duo, and then they draw 2 more cards and they get like a Rakano Outlaw and a Crown Watch Paladin, or they get a Rakano Outlaw and the power they need to cast their Icaria or something. Like, I don't know. I'm not sure if this is going to be all that good. It's got some interesting Nightfall triggers. It is basically just a card for a card that sometimes isn't a card for a card, and then like also it causes some like Nightfall effects, so deals damage to the opponent. It definitely belongs in some shadow aggro decks, and I can see that there are some really interesting ways to play around with this, where you basically just disable your opponent's blockers, mess up their like Teacher of Humility and all of their like early merchants and all of that stuff. The fact that this can hit merchants is particularly good. It can't hit power cards at all, so that's important to note. But any card with an actual power cost is, yeah, that's going to be pretty crazy to hit. So this is a spiky card, to be sure. You want to play it basically in spiky aggro decks that really want to do just ridiculous things early on. You can play it in some control decks that focus around Nightfall, and it is a 1-cost Nightfall trigger, which is always a little bit dangerous. This is probably one of the better 1-cost Nightfall triggers that is. Like, it certainly plays a little bit more than like Gloaming Wisp at 1, or Harbinger's Bite, which I like Harbinger's Bite, but there isn't a Harbinger's Bite aggro deck out there at the moment. And it does have pretty sincere drawbacks as far as things go. So, like, yeah, you can hit cards like Hailstorm, you can hit cards like Merchants, you can hit really a lot of things that mess up your aggro setup, and that means that you actually have the ability to put Stone Scar aggro back on the map with this card. It is not like a huge control setup, so there are reasons that I don't like it particularly. I just have terrible luck with these cards, guys. Like, Sabotage is actually a good card. Treachery is a good card. Shakedown is certainly fine. I just end up not hitting with this so often that it just feels bad. But like, this card is nonetheless pretty okay, and it's an okay shadow card for some aggro setups. Yeah, I don't have too much to say about it. It's probably going to be good, and it's probably going to be one of the most likely cards to make a tier 1 deck, but it's only going to make a couple of them, and it's only going to be aggro. So, yeah, overall, pretty cool. I'm always glad to see the central villain of Eternal, like, making his appearance again, and also this guy. I'm not sure who this guy is, but... Sorry, I was supposed to like be hovering my mouse over this, but I can't actually do that the way that I set up. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and yeah, we're gonna just move on to the next one. What's the last one? I think this is the last one now. Excuse me while I accidentally spin the wheel here. I've forgotten how to do things with my deck. There we go. Alright. We've done Waystone Titan. Done Tilute Queen's Hand. Alright, here we go. Tilute Queen's Hand, that's the card. So, last one. 7 cost 6/6, Tilute Queen's Hand. This is a double green card that says when you attack the enemy player with 1 unit, play a +3/+3 weapon on it, play 2 Justice Sigils from your hand depleted, or from your deck depleted, not your hand, and enemy units get -1. Boy, I like this card. So yeah, like as mono green goes, this is really interesting. It plays around with like Oathbook and some other shenanigans. It has some onboard impact. Cards that have abilities like this do actually have what you would call like instant impact, or they have the ability to generate value before they can be removed by any sort of fast spell effect, would be the best way to describe it. And that's always something that you want to keep an eye out for, because those cards are typically always really, really powerful in card games, because they are cards that get advantage without costing you anything. They don't just evenly trade with stuff. Like you can play this unit and you will always get something out of it. In this case, the thing that you get out of it is 2 rounds of ramp and potentially a lot of damage and a +3/+3 weapon, and, you know, like all of the nasty anti-block stuff. Also, the enemy units get -1 strength. I didn't even notice, but this is actually not until end of turn. That's just a permanent -1 buff to everything that your opponent is doing. I think this is the other guy in the End of Hostilities, not the End of Hostilities, Unbreakable Alliance art. No, it is End of Hostilities. But it's one of Eilyn's bodyguards. So we have Hand of the Queen and Daraka Queen's Guard. Yeah, pretty cool little dude. So what all is going on with this card? Well, first off, it plays really well with all sorts of extra ramp stuff. Like if you're playing something like Martial Ironthorn or something along those lines, then attacking with Martial Ironthorn probably works out. You get an 8/8 attacker, your opponent has a lot less ability to deal with that card, and you play 4 Justice Sigils from your deck. Or 2 Justice Sigils from your deck, and you get like a double setup. If you play around with like cards like Oathbook and other stuff that allows you to attack with just 1 unit, then you get pretty big benefits out of this. This plays really well with Aegis units and like big Combre stuff. It is not like the same kind of thing that plays with the sort of aggressive stand together style decks that want to attack with a lot of different things, but I think the benefit to just generally getting everything out on this card is not at all bad, and certainly there are a lot of cards that actually really benefit from having weapons placed on them in the first place. For example, Copperhall Paladin. Copperhall Paladin is a 3/4 that when you play a weapon on it, plays a Justice Sigil from your deck depleted. So it's also a 3/4 lifesteal, so you could just attack with that, get a 7/8 lifesteal, get 3 Justice Sigils from your deck depleted, which means that you are now ramped. Like, you have the ability to cast New Tomorrow at this point. And yeah, like just crazy, insane ramp combined with proactive like board presence and also some amount of sweepiness. All of that is like the kind of greed that I love. I am really fond of Ironthorn decks in general. It's probably my favorite archetype in Eternal at the moment. I have played a lot of jank, and this is the jank that I like really enjoy for like bringing into the professional scene. Like, I think Ironthorn decks actually just have a lot of strength to them, and big Combre decks have a lot of strength to them, and this is a card that really supports that archetype. It also supports some pretty interesting like Argenport setups. You can do like, this is a fine card with Tavrod if you just want to like attack with a is it a 9/10 Tavrod? I think it's a little bit bigger than that even. A little bit more health. So yeah, just go completely nuts with it. You can do crazy stuff with this card, and the card has immediate onboard impact, which is very important. At 7, that's, you know, a difficult setup to hit, and there are some cards at 7 that you're going to want to play in other setups. For example, like Sword of the Sky King is already pretty playable. Eilyn Clan Mother is another one that actually has a lot of already good onboard impact. But like, yeah, I can definitely see this like being played with Eilyn and some other stuff. So like, there may not be a slot for it in most decks, but I think that Mono Justice loves it. You certainly If you have a Justice primary deck that is playing a lot of Aegis stuff, something like Huru with Jotun Feastcaller, or anything along those lines with a Millie or Valkyries, a lot of flyers, that kind of thing, you can do some pretty good results with that. Like, this is a card that automatically activates Ikaria almost every time. So if you're playing with the new Ikaria, Ikaria Guard Captain, I think, Guard Captain Ikaria, I can't remember her name, that'll just automatically activate Guard Captain Ikaria and make her like an 8/4, so, or an 8/7. Wow. Yeah, so there's a lot of ridiculous stuff that happens with this card, and it just does so much on board. Ramp is a little bit less useful late in the game, so it's nice that it's a lot of ramp. The enemy units get -1 effect is pretty powerful, and the +3/+3 weapon is probably the most important thing. You also get like the extra bonuses there. And I keep adding like the +1 from Oathbook when I'm making these calculations, so I apologize because I'm pretty sure all of my stats are off. For some reason I'm just assuming that you have a Paladin Oathbook automatically active, or a Minotaur Oathkeeper or something along those lines. But yeah, you still get like a 7/6 Ikaria, and so on and so forth. This card's exciting. I think it's going to be a lot of fun to play with. It's really just kind of hitting all the right bases. Like, it's fun, it's pretty competitive, it is good, but not in a way that's going to be like completely outright insane. It's got really good like automatic impact. So yeah, like overall, I think it's just going to do most of what you want it to do. Like, it seems perfectly worth it to play in big fun decks. It plays well in big Combre with Mystic Ascendant and World Bear Behemoth and all of that nonsense. Like, you've got just lots and lots of good things to do with Tulute, and it's pretty easy to figure out what those things are. So we will definitely be doing a lot of brewing with Tulute when that card comes out. That's it for the Eternal card breakdown for this week. We will be back with more spoilers, if there are any, before Into Darkness launches. It's supposed to happen sometime this week, so it could be as early as Tuesday or as late as Saturday. But yeah, we will see it very, very soon, I think. Thank you guys so much for watching, and for the YouTube folks, I will see you next time. Have a really, really good night, everyone.